Welcome to ICOR's March webinar, the second in a series of our 2017 webinars. I am presenting the webinar today. My name is Linda Nelson. I am the ICOR President. I am an expert member of ISO 268. It is an international standard committee that's focused on community resilience in the context of sustainable development. I also serve as an expert member of ISO Technical Committee 292, where we do work focused on community resilience as well as business continuity topics. Thirdly, I serve on a task force that coordinates the work between ISO 292 and the United Nations International Society on Disaster Risk Reduction. Today's webinars include understanding the different definitions for community resilience and how the definition itself impacts the strategy for increasing a community's resilience. We're going to learn how community resilience is increased when there is an intentional effort to increase the disaster preparedness of the community, and we're going to identify strategies on how responsible governance, a strong economy, a healthy environment, and a high quality of life increases the resilience of the community. And lastly, we're going to look at understanding what resources are currently available to assess a community's resilience. If you have questions during the webinar, you can use the questions menu or questions button on your menu, and we will address those questions at the end of the webinar, or I will follow up with you after the webinar to make sure that they get answered. So here's our major challenge. There is no consensus on the definition for community resilience. An organization called PLOS, I guess it's stated PLOS, I'm not really sure, but they are an organization that is online, and it's pretty interesting. They do peer-reviewed, citable, and publicly archived research and trying to get research published as quickly as possible. And they identified 80 relevant papers that all had to do with how to define community resilience. And the consensus was, at the end of the study, was that there was no agreed-upon definition. What they did find when they reviewed those 80 definitions was that there were some common elements. So when they reviewed all these different definitions, they found 9 things in common. They found that it's important for a community to have local knowledge. So they need to understand the community's existing vulnerabilities, and they say that if you address your vulnerabilities prior to any sort of disaster or incident, that it will build resilience within your community. You also need to have a network and relationships within your community itself, as well as relationships with communities around you. The connectedness of a community is sometimes called its social network, and creating links among community members based on these social relationships or social networks are example of how to be connected. And you need to also build the cohesion within your community as well. The third common element was communication, that there needs to be an ability to communicate as well as your communication needs to be effective. Your community also needs to be healthy. So looking at the pre-existing health of a community, and while as far as its delivery of health services, are important for community resilience. So looking at your health vulnerabilities can help to build resilience before a disaster and also to mitigate long-term issues after a disaster. In addition, the fifth element looks at its governance and leadership structure, and how communities handle crises is really based on the governance and leadership aspects. So there were several subcategories within this element that supported the fact that having an effective governance and leadership structure really impacted the resilience of the community, just like governance and leadership impacts every organization as well. The sixth common element had to do with resources. So not just having numerous resources, but adequate resources. They're looking at things from having tangible supplies such as food, water, first aid kits, to technical resources such as shelter, automobiles, and essential machinery. And what they found was a higher level of resources is generally supposed to lead to higher levels of resilience. Other publications have also looked at resources as being things like natural, physical, human, financial, and social resources. The economic investment into a community's resilience is very important because there's a direct economic cost of a disaster as well as indirect costs that could affect a community long after that has occurred. We've seen that a lot with disasters around the world, that it's really the long-term cost that has impacted the community's resilience. Included in the 9 common elements is preparedness. Almost all of the publications mentioned the importance of preparedness across a number of levels, including the individual, the family, and the government. In spite of this, only a few publications actually identified specific activities that could be used to mitigate the effects of a disaster. And lastly, the 9th common element is called mental outlook, and this one was something that I hadn't really considered. They're using mental outlook to look at kind of the culture of the community. So just like last month when we talked about organizational resilience, we looked at the culture of the organization having an impact on the organization's resilience, so does the mental outlook or the culture of a community. So they look at the attitudes, feelings, and views within a community itself, within its leaders, and as well as its community members. So when they looked at these 80 different definitions, they tried to put them into some sort of categories. And there were 3 primary categories that they used. One was kind of process definitions. So how does the organization adapt and change over time? The second type of definition filled into the category of an absence of an adverse effect. In other words, it didn't hurt us. Whatever the thing that happened didn't have a negative impact on us. We were able to maintain stable functioning. And the third type of definition looks at community resilience as a range of positive attributes. So a range of things that a community could be doing to increase its resilience. So we're going to take a poll, and the poll question asks you to identify what you think could be the primary or most important aspect of defining community resilience. Is it an ongoing process of change and adaptation, an ability to maintain stable functioning, or a broad collection of response-related abilities or positive attributes? So we will give you maybe 20 or 30 seconds to identify which one you think is the most important. So Tiffany, what were the poll results?
Linda, we have 69% believe that the ability to manage change and adapt is the primary important aspect. 23% is the ability to maintain stable functioning after an incident.
Okay, and just a handful of people looked at the identification of a range of positive attributes. That's really interesting. Let's continue on to see what else there is to learn about community resilience. So there are several organizations that have participated in some studies, and I have to tell you that we could have probably had this webinar last all day if we wanted to review all the different work that's going on in the area of community resilience. Compared to the work that's going on in organizational resilience, community resilience is probably 100-fold more studied than organizational resilience. So I had to make a decision as to which organizations we should look at. I'll share with you some other resources at the end of the webinar, but I had to identify the ones that I thought would make the most sense and that that looked at community resilience from different aspects to give you 3 different perspectives on that. So the first organization is one that's been around for quite a while. It's called the Community and Regional Resilience Institute, or CARI for short, and they have identified or defined community resilience as the ability or the capability to anticipate risk, limit impact, and bounce back rapidly through survival, adaptability, evolution and growth in the face of turbulent change. Lots of activities there. Their focus for their definition is on regaining functionality after a disaster, and they have identified that resilience is an attribute of the community, that it's an inherent and dynamic part of a community, that it doesn't go away, and that it needs to be focusing on adaptation, and adaptation specifically to adversity, and that when you do adapt, that it leads to a positive outcome for the community relative to its state after a crisis, especially in terms of its functionality. So notice it's really tied to a crisis or a disaster. And the fact that these attributes that they've identified allows communities to be compared in terms of their ability to positively adapt to adversity. Very strongly focused on adaptability and adaptability specifically to adversity. The second organization is called the Institute for Sustainable Communities, and they have looked at 4 ways that you can cultivate aspects to make your community more resilient. So the first aspect is an economic aspect, and they've identified that a more resilient economy cultivates multiple employers that are constantly innovating and evolving. So if 1 or 2 become obsolete, many more are ready to step in and fill the gap. They look at cities that have maybe, you've heard of the term company towns, and it's great. You might have a really strong economy when your company town or the company that's in your town is doing very, very well. But when that company leaves or it shuts down for whatever reason, there is no more work in that community. So they're looking for the Institute for Sustainable Communities is looking for a resilient economy by making sure it's diverse and has several employers so that they can fill in the gap if one of them leaves. Their second aspect is environmental. They're talking about natural resources and the fact that your environment impacts the community and its access to natural resources. Here in the U.S., we looked at Detroit in Michigan, where their water was not, where they couldn't drink it and they couldn't even use it to bathe. That happens in different communities around the world, and it definitely impacts its environment. Also talking about the environment as well as the healthiness to live in that environment. The third aspect to community resilience that they look about is the social aspect, and that they understand that people in the community do better in disasters when they have good social networks and connections. This kind of ties to the networking side that we looked at the former definition. But they also talk about the fact that the most vulnerable and disadvantaged populations don't oftentimes have a seat at the decision-making table. So they talk about the fact that it's important in your social networks that you bring to the table those organizations that support those types of populations in your community. And the third area is the fourth area is diversity, and looking at diversifying your community to reduce its vulnerabilities and increase innovation and adaptability. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble pronouncing words today. So they talk, the author of an article for the Institute for Sustainable Communities talks about when you have a totalitarian type of country, that they sometimes are inherently less innovative and adaptable just because you have sort of a group speak or everybody following in one direction. So it's important for your leadership to be diverse and that you look at groups with different interests and across boundaries of geography, institution, race, class, even the idea of entrenched perspectives and social grouping, that you can't have true innovation when we're unless we are challenged to connect with one another and think creatively about our problems. I mentioned the United Nations work on disaster risk reduction. They have now moved, even though their name is still the UNIS, or UNIN, I can almost pronounce UNISDR, an acronym. They have moved to the term disaster resilience. So they've kind of gone from disaster risk reduction to the term resilience, kind of going with the latest trends, and they have identified 10 essentials. So in their area, they have the first 3 essentials are all tied to corporate or city governance. So they want you to be able to organize for disaster resilience. In other words, it should be intentional. Your community should identify, understand, and use current and future risk scenarios. And you should attempt to strengthen your financial capacity for resilience as well. And all of those 3 are tied to sort of the corporate governance aspect. The essentials 4 through 8 cover many of the dimensions regarding planning and disaster preparation. So pursuing a resilient urban development and design, safeguarding natural buffers to enhance the protective functions offered by natural ecosystems, so looking at the environmental aspects, to strengthen institutional capacity for resilience, so looking at the organizations within your community as well, understanding and strengthening your social capacity, we talked about social capacity earlier, and increase your infrastructure resilience. So in the United States, we have some work being done by Department of Homeland Security and FEMA that looks specifically at infrastructure resilience. So this is part of the disaster resilience scorecard under integrated planning. And then the last 2 aspects of the scorecard, or last 2 essentials of the scorecards, cover your disaster response itself and your post-event recovery. So looking at an effective disaster response, as well as an expedited recovery and an ability to build back better. So we've looked at 3 organizations and the kind of strategies that they are proposing to increase the resilience of communities. We're going to take our next poll. Which organization has identified a strategy that makes the most sense to you?
Okay, Linda, it looks like CARRI, with their plan to adapt, evolve, and grow during turbulent change, has 48% of our viewers capturing their attention there. ISC, 24%, cultivate economic, environmental, social, and diversity, and about 29% has identified UNISDR with their addressing 10 essential strategies there.
So that is really interesting. With my work that I have done in the international community, the United Nations believes, of course, that they have the best programs and that they have looked at all of those. And so if perhaps our audience today was more international, we might see some different voting going on there. It kind of ties together with what you identified in the first poll, though, this focus on adaptability and evolving and managing change, which is what CARRI looks at as well. The fact is, though, that the CARRI plan, and I'm going to argue with some of you in your poll responses, and I'm hoping to change your mind a little bit by the end of this webinar, is very much focused on the disaster risk reduction as well as the United Nations. Those are very much focused at measuring a community's resilience to how it manages its disasters and how it prepares for that. So that is really interesting. So there kind of leads into my next question. Is being resilient against disasters enough? And you can probably guess that that question is out there because it is my opinion that it is one element, but it is not the only element, and that we need to look further. So what I'd like to do next is take a look at some organizations that have expanded the scope of what they consider what community resilience is and how to increase the resilience of a community. And I also wanted to address the term city. There are some people that have really differentiated between resilient cities and resilient communities. For the purposes of this webinar, we consider them the same. A community can be large or small. It can be an entire country. It can be a small town. So we're not going to worry about the difference between the city and a community for this webinar. So there's an organization called Post-Carbon Institute that I had actually never heard of. So they have been around for about 2 to 3 years. They're out in California, here in the United States. And in the work that I have done for the past 10 years, I had not heard of them. So they are somewhat new on board, and they've got some interesting work that they're doing. And they have defined community resilience as the ability of a community to maintain and evolve, so kind of the two aspects, maintain and evolve its identity in the face of both short-term and long-term changes while cultivating environmental, social, and economic sustainability. So they have combined the definition of the idea of adaptability, managing change, and growing with looking at sustainability of its environment, social, and economic areas. And they have identified 6 foundations of building community resilience. The first one is its people. And in here, for the people, I would compare that to what we saw with some of the other ones talking about social aspects. So the power to envision the future of the community and build its resilience resides within its community members, whether they're the government leaders, or whether they're the people, or whether they're the most vulnerable. So understanding who your people are in your community is going to be very, very important when you're building a more resilient community. Also looking at systems thinking. So we saw earlier with some of the other organizations, they talked about networking and building a systems approach. So you need to understand the systems within your community and understand how complex and interrelated they are, and understand the fact that you've got complex crises unfolding. So how does that impact your similarly complex community? So you cannot be thinking always in verticals. You need to be thinking about the systems within your community and all the organizations that make up your community as well. Of course, they look at a foundation being built upon the adaptability, how well you are able to manage change, because challenges are dynamic. They're not the same as they were yesterday. Everything is changing very rapidly. And when we're looking at the speed of change today being so much different than what it was when we were children, we look at how the world changed for our parents and how the world changed for our grandparents is very, very different. When you're in a larger city or you're in a more urban environment, that change may be more dynamic than in a smaller type of community, but change is there, and you need to be able to manage that change and adapt to it. This is a concept that we haven't seen before today in this presentation, looking at the idea of transformability and the concept that some challenges are so big that it is not possible for the community to simply adapt. You're going to need to make some fundamental and transformative changes in order to survive. So considering that, you need to be able to adapt, but it might not be enough, and you might need to change completely. And some of these concepts are not just about communities. These foundations could be tied to any organization as well. We've heard the word sustainability. Sustainability has been a hot topic or a buzzword for several years. It is now being used in the aspect of community resilience. So it needs to be sustainable. The work that you're doing on community resilience needs to be sustainable, and it needs to serve not only your own community and only right now. It needs to work for other communities, for future generations, and the ecosystems on which we all depend. So they're looking at sustainability here in a much broader context than what you might have seen in the past. And like the foundation of transformability, this idea of courage I thought was really interesting. We've talked about culture, both culture of organizations, culture of people, as well as culture of communities. And here they're talking about, as individuals and as a community, we need to have courage to confront challenging issues and take responsibility for our collective future. It's really interesting when you look at community resilience and you look at this idea of culture and community as well as courage, that some people just don't want to deal with it. And if your leadership and your government structure doesn't want to deal with community resilience, it is going to impact the overall resilience of your community. The Rockefeller Foundation has done some really interesting work. Of course, they're very well funded, which helps with that. And they have also been working with the United Nations with some of their work. And they have put together a city resilience framework, and they've also put together a city resilience index. And we're going to take a look at both of those. Their definition is actually a list of capabilities, what we might call indicators, and it kind of looks at what we looked at for our third definition for community resilience. The Rockefeller Foundation is certainly building on this idea that a resilient community or a resilient city has certain capabilities and looking at it from that aspect. So a resilient city is a city where there is or are minimal human vulnerabilities, where you've got diverse livelihoods and employment. We've talked about that before. Where you've got effective safeguards to human health and life. Where you've got a collective identity and community support, so there's actually a culture in that community that works together. The fifth capability is one that we haven't seen before, and that is a comprehensive security and rule of law, meaning it's a safe place for people to live. And we'll talk more about this when we look at the ICOR's resilience framework. Your economy needs to be sustainable. So here you're seeing the word sustainable again as it relates to the economy. The community needs to have reduced exposure and fragility. So they cannot be fragile. You need to be looking at what are your exposures. And depending on where your community is located, what kind of environment it has, what its susceptibility and vulnerability to natural disasters, it's going to be different from community to community. You need to have effective provision of critical services. So we've talked earlier about having emergency services, for example. We talked about in number 5, security types of services. So what the community itself needs to not only have those critical services, but be able to provide them when needed. There needs to be reliable communication and mobility. So one of the other organizations talked about having communication systems, where the Rockefeller Foundation is talking about a reliable and mobile communication system. The idea of effective leadership and management is not new, so having a governance structure in place that is managing this. Also the idea of empowered stakeholders, that community members need to be empowered to make decisions and to be able to improve the resilience of the part that they can impact. And an integrated development planning. So looking at planning, we often talk about, city planning and government planning, and making sure that planning for resilience is part of that overall planning for your community. They have put together this model that they use. So this is their framework. It's a picture of their framework, and then they have taken this framework and created their index from it. So that this framework has 4 dimensions or categories, which are leadership and strategy, health and well-being, economy and society, and infrastructure and ecosystems. They've also developed 12 goals. So within each dimension or category, there are 3 goals for each. And these are goals that every city or community should strive towards in order to achieve resilience. The research done by the Rockefeller Institute, that says that, the Rockefeller Foundation, I should say, says that universally, these are what matters most when a city faces a wide range of chronic problems or a sudden disaster or catastrophe. And when it's recognized within the framework, then you can then look at the relative importance of each goal and how they are realized, and understanding that these are going to be unique for each city. They've also identified 7 qualities or 7 characteristics of a resilient city. So the city needs to be flexible, redundant, robust, resourceful, reflective, inclusive, and integrative. So looking at these qualities, They could be considered characteristics, and you'll see the word flexible could be the word adaptive, robust, having plenty of resources. These are the sorts of qualities that we have seen identified as indicators as well for some of the others. So moving to their index, what they have then done is take the dimension or category of health and well-being, and they have the 3 goals of minimal human vulnerability, diverse likelihoods in employment, and effective safeguards to human health and life. And they have then identified 52 indicators that tie to each of those. And some of the indicators are tied to more than one. So they might actually apply to more than one of the goals. This is another way they use their index, so that we've taken those same indicators and tied them to the goals. So under the minimal human vulnerability goal, they've identified 5 indicators to support that, which is that you have safe and affordable housing, adequate affordable energy supply, inclusive access to safe drinking water, effective sanitation, and sufficient affordable food supply. Under the goal of diverse livelihoods and employment, you've got inclusive labor policies, relevant skills and training, dynamic local business development and innovation, supportive financing mechanisms, and diverse protection of livelihoods following a shock. And the last goal under health and well-being is effective safeguards to human health and life. Here we talk about a robust public health systems, adequate access to quality health care, emergency medical care, and effective emergency response services. The third one I wanted to share with you today is one that's been developed in the United States, and it's called the STAR Community Rating System. They have developed a framework and a certification system. So you can see under the STAR Community Rating, a community can be actually credentialed or certified with 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 stars, so they get a rating, a star rating, based on the built environment. And here they have their indicators here below. So looking at noise and light, community water, compact and complete, and there's much more information behind each one of those. Housing affordability, how you do redevelopment, having public parks and transportation choices. So you're seeing some different things with the STAR community than we saw with the Rockefeller Foundation's index. They look at climate and energy, so looking at climate adaptation, your greenhouse gases, greening your energy supply, how you use your energy efficiency, your water efficiency, what are your resource footprint with your local government and how to minimize waste. Looking at the economy and jobs, so business retention development, again, they're very focused on green. Your local economy and making sure you have quality jobs with living wages. What's your industry development target? And what is your workforce readiness? Looking at sort of the health and viability of your community, looking at your education and arts, that you have arts and culture, that you've got some cohesion, kind of the culture aspect. What are your educational opportunities? How do you preserve your historical data? Your social and cultural diversity, as well as how you manage the aging in your community. Looking at equity and empowerment, so civic engagement, civil and human rights, environmental justice, equitable service and access to those, human services, as well as poverty prevention and alleviation. Talking about health and safety, so are people in your community active? What kind of community health services do you have? How do you manage your emergency management? What about access to food and nutrition, your health systems, your hazard mitigation, and you're having a safe community? Your natural systems, again, talking about green, your biodiversity, natural resource protection, your air quality, your water, and your working lands. And lastly, innovation and process, dealing with best practices and processes, exemplary performance, local innovation, and good governance. And I wanted to just show you what this looks like if you wanted to look and see if your city was part of the resilient communities or a certified STAR community. They have actually, they listed them by how many points they get. So when you do this evaluation, you get points. So you've got 4 cities that have 5 stars. We've got quite a few cities that have 4 stars. Then we have 3-star communities. And it looks like they don't give you any recognition if you only have 2 or 1 star. It's just interesting. So this is a way that you can actually evaluate your community and to get yourself recognized. The last one I wanted to look at is completely different from the other ones, and this came from a study done by Citigroup. It's called City for Cities, and they have a study that was published by The Economist, and they look at resilience as based on a city's competitiveness. And here they look at resilience as a city's ability to attract capital, businesses, talent, and visitors. And they see competitiveness as a holistic concept. And that economic size and growth matter, and that there are different factors that support that. So when they put together a benchmarking tool, they're looking at evaluating what your future competitive might look like. The first one was your economic strength, and one of the things that they did was they weighted theirs. So the other 2 studies that we've done, that I've shared with you, and their way of measurement doesn't have any weighting with them, except for the fact that with the star one, you might have more things to do within each category. So you could earn more points potentially within each category. But the economic strength here was given of course this is written by The Economist, so that would make some sense, but is given the highest weighting, which is at 30%. They look at the physical capital of your community, and they gave that a weighting of 10%, and they're looking at physical infrastructure, public transport, telecommunications. Your financial maturity got 10% as well. The depth and breadth of your financial cluster, where is your central bank, what's the location of your banks and agencies, and the location of your country's main stock exchange. And your institutional charter got 15%. So how does your community vote? What's your electoral process? How is your government fiscally autonomous from the companies? What's the rule of law? Is your government effective, and how does it manage taxation? They then look at social and cultural character, so we see that come up again, and that gave a 5% rating. So freedom of expression and human rights, open and diversity, presence of crime, and cultural vibrancy. Your global appeal, how is it able to attract global business? What's your international flight ranking? In other words, travel to and from. What about your conference and convention development, ability for higher education, and then this idea of globally renowned think tanks? So they gave this a 10% weighting. Human capital was given a 15% rating as far as, and they looked at population growth, working age population, the risk-taking mindset I thought was interesting, as well as entrepreneurship, the quality of your education and healthcare, how much do they hire foreign nationals, and the women's economic opportunity. What I found the most interesting is they do talk about a community's environment and natural hazards, the risk of natural disasters, and your environmental governance, but they gave it only a 5% rating. So what we have seen today is some really different ways of looking at how you might measure a community's resilience, with being completely about disaster risk reduction and environmental and natural hazards, to being only 5% of that rating. So I found that something that we need to consider is that in your community, if you're talking about an organization and your company moving into a community, looking at how they evaluate a community's level of resilience, is it purely based on its economy, like the Economist would suggest, or is it much more based on disaster risk reduction? So I'd like you to do your third and final poll and ask, what do you think would provide the best measurement of a community's level of resilience?
And Linda, looks like 62% of our audience believes that the STAR community rating system would be the best tool to measure. 33% the Rockefeller Foundation City Resilience Index, and 5% believe the Economist Benchmarking Index. And I would agree there with the STAR community rating, seeing there were 2 cities in the Illinois area that I could relate to. So that was actually, I would agree with this.
Okay. What I think is interesting is that the STAR community rating system has been tested. I mean, you can see results from it, and that makes it somewhat valued because you can then see that there's a way for you to do an actual measurement. The Rockefeller Foundation City Resilience Indicators, they don't have any way of, they do have a measurement, but they don't have a way of showing you how cities have scored against their indicators. So I think if they can do that, it might actually improve things. And I also think, and I will challenge you, that if you were a business owner and if you were in charge of identifying a community where you think your organization should work and where you're going to invest income, that you might actually look at the Economist index more than you would look at maybe the Rockefeller or the STAR rating. So just consider that, that some of your ideas for looking at measurement tools might be impacted by the kind of work that you do in your organization. I wanted to conclude the webinar with sharing with you some of the work that ICOR has done on our community resilience framework. What we have done is read and studied all of these different frameworks that are out there. We have read more than 80 studies, more than 80 papers on how you can measure and define your community's resilience. And what we have done is then taken that and combined those into what we're calling 5 systems. So we have 5 primary systems, would be the healthy environment, the responsible governance, quality of life, strong economy, and a prepared system. And what we understand and what we're advocating is that when an individual system is strong, it creates capital for the community. And when an individual system is weak, it makes the community vulnerable. And the community resilience framework encourages a systems view where each system is part of a larger system that works together. That whole idea of the networking aspect. A community's resilience increases when there is more adaptive capacity, as we do know, and decreases when it is more vulnerable and less able to change or manage change and endure stress. A community relies on its systems to be strong and flexible, to be able to evolve and adapt when necessary, and to be sufficiently agile to take advantage of opportunities when they arise. When an individual system operates with spare capacity, has the capacity to rebound quickly, and reestablish its functions to avoid long-term disruptions, and encourages constant learning to allow new solutions as conditions change, the whole system benefits. Also remember that the resilience of a community is not static. Adaptive capacity changes over time in response to changes in the community and its level of vulnerability. We also believe that each community is unique, and therefore there really is no one-size-fits-all solution. So a community needs to have a clear vision for how it wants to increase its resilience, and then set out a roadmap for how it can get there, and utilize the tools that are available. So when we look at a healthy environment, we talk about the fact that it needs to have adequate natural resources to support its population. There needs to be access to adequate energy, food, and water. The resilient community needs to have a healthy ecosystem and habitat. There should be limited pollution in the water, air, and land, and it should have procedures for the reduction of waste and the recovery, reuse, and recycling of waste materials. It also should abide by international laws and standards to enforce those regulations. Groups that are part of managing the community's natural resources and protecting the environment should either be provided by the government or provided by privately owned companies that deliver services such as electricity, gas, waste management, and sanitation services. When we're talking about responsible governance, we need to have a governance system that is self-governing and self-sustaining. It should provide the services needed by the community members, such as transportation, power and energy, water, wastewater, and communication systems. A responsible governance system also provides for the development and maintenance of the community's environment and infrastructure. The government needs to protect its community members and have emergency services capabilities. It should also have governing bodies, laws, and representation and enforce its laws in a humane manner. There should be a capacity to deliver within government bodies at all levels, so including managing its finances to ensure funding of the needed activities and meeting budget requirements under changing conditions. And the leadership of the community should be looking both at long-term as well as short-term issues. When we're looking at having a strong economy, all communities require economic health and development in order to thrive. So a resilient community is one where community members have access to good jobs and good wages and where employment is based primarily on education and skills. The community needs to produce enough goods to meet the needs of its community members. And a resilient community has a diversified economy that supports sustainability. A healthy economic system depends on the ease of doing business. It depends on public transportation systems, its economic networks, energy efficiency, and property and living costs. It also depends on access to funding and resources, both financial and physical, to maintain its value of its currency. Looking at quality of life, the quality of life inside a community directly impacts its resilience. Communities can be vulnerable when there exists internal tensions due to unfairness. In a resilient community, all members of the community are equal and diversity is valued. There exists social freedoms such as freedom of speech and freedom of worship in the religion of their choosing. A community needs to provide its members with public education system and provide equal opportunities for education of all of its community members. Informal education should be available for community members to access additional learning through traditional and non-traditional methods. And a healthy community includes access to knowledge repositories and information systems such as a library or the internet. And includes availability of world and community news as well. The resilient community places a high value on human life, and community members have access to affordable housing, access to quality and affordable health care, and they have the freedom to worship as well. And a resilient community is one where it is safe for the communities or the community members to live. And lastly but not least, this is really a change in our framework that we had developed back in 2007. We hadn't focused specifically on being a prepared system. We thought we had recognized it, but we decided that given all of the work being done by different organizations globally, that we needed to make sure that this was identified clearly. So communities do need to reduce their vulnerability to natural and man-made disasters. This requires planned and funded risk reduction activities as well as preparing to manage through disruptive incidents and to be resilient against disasters. There needs to be a strong emergency management system that supports the efforts of local police, firefighters, and other emergency management personnel as required. Being prepared also requires a community to build networks and partnerships, not just with other communities and governmental bodies, but also with the organizations it serves in both the public and private sectors. Being disaster resilient requires educating community members on how to protect themselves and how to be more prepared individually. A prepared system ensures that it has adequate resources and expertise necessary to assist the victims of disasters as well. It also depends on the resilience of the organizations within it. So the resilience of each organization, a culture of innovation, and its ability to provide its goods and services under all conditions will have a strong impact on the overall resilience of the community. Resilient communities encourage preparedness, innovation, and recognize the resilience of the organizations within its community. So a thought for the day, not a poll, just a thought. How are you going to use the information provided today in your job? I want you to think about that and how, I'm assuming that not everybody on this webinar is in charge of emergency management in your community. So how can you use this information in your job? To summarize, I want to state that there are many definitions of community resilience, often tied to a single aspect of what makes a community more or less resilient. And a community's resilience is impacted by many variables and is not a constant state. We've identified different indicators for measuring the current state of of a community's resilience, and they're understanding that there is no single approach to increasing the community's resilience, but each of them does require an intentional effort. So I want you to consider the different tools that we've looked at today, and also on our website we have many more tools. So these are the tools that we've referenced today on here, but I want to show you where you can go to learn more. On our Community Resilience Framework, so under Resilience Framework, it's here. You can find all of the resources that we have found that support each of these different systems. And some of the research will be in all 5 systems, and some of the other ones will just be in one or more particular ones. So here, like dealing with climate and changing communities, especially is under environment. Something like the City Resilience Framework developed by the Rockefeller Foundation might be under all 5. So you can download these and have access to them, and all of the ones that we talked about today are also included here. And if you find that we have missed one, or 2 or 3, or however many, we would like you to donate and share a resource, because we're trying to make sure. It's very hard to keep up on all of the different things that are coming out. This is an area of study, like I mentioned when we started, that has been growing over the past 5 years, and there's just a ton of work out there. So please help us to keep this up to date. And if you're not sure on how to donate, go ahead and contact us by clicking on that link. We have about 5 minutes left. Tiffany, were there any questions that we can help to address? Or if you have a question, feel free to make note of it or post it.
Yeah, Linda, there was actually a couple of comments. So the one question was about the webinar. Is this going to be recorded and available?
Yes, it is being recorded, and it will be available. In fact, I can show you on the website where that is. Under education, we have, I can go under webinars. So last month's webinar is still available. It'll be available to the end of the month, and then it'll be moved to our members-only research center. This Register Now button will be replaced with View Webinar Recording within about 24 hours. It takes us about 24 hours to download the recording and get it back uploaded to our website.
Okay, and a comment here states, I cannot but agree with all these points, but to say these are prerequisites will frustrate most communities, as they require resources that most communities either do not have or are out of their control.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know about the word prerequisites, but the idea that, you know, there is no end state to making a community resilient, just like there's no end state to making an organization resilient. But what are the goals? What are you trying to work on? So where are your vulnerabilities? And looking at the idea that a community needs to address its vulnerabilities, whether they're economic vulnerabilities, whether they're environmental vulnerabilities, and then having a strategy for how they're going to work on increasing the resilience or reducing the vulnerabilities in those areas. And that is going to be completely community-based, and it's going to be different from community to community. Any other questions, Tiffany? I did see, just as I'm missing Tiffany, I do see a couple questions. One says, how can this framework be used nationally, as well as a national resilient development framework? I think, you know, initially it's educating our communities that frameworks exist. So sharing the different frameworks here, whether it's ICOR's framework or any of the other frameworks, and having that conversation with your community in that, how are you looking at this? And that's really the starting point, is starting that conversation. So whether you're a part of your Chamber of Commerce in your community, or however way you have a way to have a voice in your community, you need to be able to ask those questions and really challenge your community to say, what are you focusing on? Have you identified your vulnerabilities, and how can the different members of our community help support the work that you're doing? And it looks like that was our last question. So if there aren't any other questions, we will close for today, and thank you for attending. And we will, again, this webinar will be available within about 24 hours on our website, and we invite you to attend one of our next webinars. The webinar that we have on April 20th will actually occur in the morning if you're in Central Standard Time here in the U.S. The speaker is actually a speaker at a university and teaches in the afternoon, so he was not available. But he's going to be talking about the impact of natural cultures. So the fact is that when you're looking at the resilience of an organization, and if you're working globally, you're going to need to be doing your work differently, and you're going to need to be speaking differently and understanding how national cultures impact how people work within that country and in that area will help you within your own organization as you work with different organizations and with your own organization if it is a global organization. It's some really interesting information. This is it's an actual course that's taught as part of the U.S. military, and it's a required course for people who work in different countries. And so we have taken aspects of that course, and we actually have it as an e-learning course for ICOR, but we're going to be taking a subset of that for our next webinar. So thank you very much. We appreciate having you here today, and enjoy the rest of your day.